Humanity is not to blame for climate change. Has it finally happened? Has he gone insane? Has the recent success he's had gone to his head? What on earth could he possibly mean by humanity is not to blame for climate change? Because the way he said it, clearly implies that he thinks climate change is a thing. Is he one of those people who think that humans are not causing it and it's just a natural process? Because that's like a psyop. That's, like nuclear power being bad. That's funded by fossil fuel interests. He couldn't possibly really believe that, could he? Oh no, please, don't misunderstand. I not only believe, but know for a fact, because there's no reasonable debate to be had on this subject, that humans are causing the climate to change. What I mean is that humanity isn't really what's causing it. And the fact that most of us think that humanity as a whole is to blame for anthropogenic climate change is the biggest fucking psyop of them all. I've seen the comparison made many times that, like, human beings are not the first species to completely change the climate of the planet, thereby causing kind of a mass extinction. During the Paleoproterozoic era, that's like 2.4 billion years ago, cyanobacteria majorly fucked up the atmosphere by introducing a lot of oxygen to it, and that kind of destroyed most of life that existed back then. And so they were the first species that did this. But humanity, of course, is worse than cyanobacteria because we know and understand that climate change is happening and that we are causing it, and we are actively choosing to continue to do it. This comparison, and especially this caveat, is, how do I put this? Extremely bullshit. The only way we could make that comparison work is if we envisioned that way back in the day, among the cyanobacteria, that there had been a very small group of cyanobacteria, perhaps like 1% of them, who owned all of the cyanobacteria wealth because that's just the kind of circumstances they were born into. And that small group of cyanobacteria used their immense systemic power to force all of the other cyanobacteria to continue changing the climate on their behalf under threat of social expulsion, starvation, homelessness, and death. Because that tiny group of cyanobacteria personally benefited from the climate changing. And they continue to do this when a plurality, if not the majority, of cyanobacteria very vocally objected to this process, took active steps to utilize their political power to stop it from happening. But of course, the elite of cyanobacteria had much more power than the masses. And they used that immense systemic power not only to counteract the efforts of the general population to curb climate change, but also used it to obfuscate the facts by introducing a lot of bullshit and gaslighting as many cyanobacteria as they could into believing things that are just not true. Because back then, not every single individual cyanobacterium was an expert on climate change science. They also needed physician cyanobacteria and plumber cyanobacteria and stripper cyanobacteria. So really, all of the climate was changed by a small cabal of powerful sociopaths adhering to an egotistical philosophy that is all about growing the size of their own bank accounts, or whatever the equivalent of bank accounts they had 2.4 billion years ago. If that were the comparison that was made, it would be good, it would be accurate, because that's what the situation is like for humanity. If you ask most people out there, they know and understand and agree that climate change is bad and needs to be stopped. It's just that, factually speaking, they are completely powerless to do so. Cyanobacteria collectively worked and furthered the event known as the oxygen crisis. They all, as individuals, contributed roughly the same amount to the whole, but humans do not individually contribute the same amount to our climate change. And much more starkly and importantly, humans are not equally to blame for climate change. And this isn't just the vast chasm in how developing nations and industrialized nations contribute to climate change. Although that certainly is a factor, the average person living in sub-Saharan Africa just does not contribute as much to climate change on an individual level as the average person living in Europe. The European just has a bigger carbon footprint as an individual. However, this is in and of itself a red herring, because the thing that the European doesn't have over the sub-Saharan African is particularly more power to change their carbon footprint. That's because the carbon footprint is an utterly terrible way of measuring contribution to climate change. I know it's taught in schools, but the individual carbon footprint is actually a literal psyop developed by a marketing firm on behalf of British Petroleum. This is not a controversial statement. It's not some obscure conspiracy theory. It's on fucking Wikipedia. And the goal of that is to collectivize the guilt, blame, and responsibility for climate change by ironically individualizing it to everyone. The overwhelming majority of carbon footprint that the average European has, they have simply because they exist in Europe. There is nothing they can do on a personal level to reduce that. And just to be clear, it is absolutely possible that that footprint be reduced in ways that are outside of that average European's power. And if that's done correctly, they wouldn't even notice. It would have zero impact on their lifestyle. But it would have an impact on the bank accounts of very rich people. And those tiny little tidbits that the average person does have control over generally very much clash with the realities of the lives we are forced to lead. Many people would love to buy green power. They just don't have an affordable option to do so in their area. That's because the people who own the fossil fuel industry have invested a huge amount of resources into hampering the development of renewable energy sources. People would love to buy products that have a minimal impact on the environment. But not only are those products generally very expensive, their marketing is also often misleading. This is because unsustainable practices are much more widely subsidized and also often just frankly cheaper. And it's also because a lot of companies would love to be able to charge the premium that comes with putting like a green dot on the label of their product without actually having to put in the money to make that product green, because that's a huge profit margin, and if you make profit margin, that's good. Yeah, most of those like eco-friendly organic labels, they're just bullshit. People would love to take the bus or like, a train instead of flying airplane across the country. But not only is public transport probably pretty garbage in their area because automobile manufacturers have made it that way, but even in Europe where we have great rail networks, if you're trying to travel like across country borders to a different place, it's hell. I swear to God, trust me on this. I have done this. It is absolutely horrid. And there may still be people who are like, oh no, but you definitely have options. You could put solar panels on your house and like proper insulation and like a gray water system inside of it. You could, learn which of those green labels are bullshit and which products are actually good for the environment, which are bad. You could grow some of your own food. I don't know if you know this, but a lot of people actually, they don't own houses themselves. They rent, and not because they love living under a landlord's yoke. And just to be real with you for a moment here, I am not going to pay for my landlord installing solar panels, insulation, and a grey water system, because those costs will go back to me, and then my landlord benefiting from selling that extra electricity, the benefits of which will not be passed on to me. And even a great chunk of the people who do happen to own houses can't afford these expensive home improvement projects. Same goes for growing your own food. I don't have a fucking garden, nor do regular working people have the time or energy to grow their own food. That's rich people shit. And the expertise and lifestyle adjustments required to navigate the bullshit and misinformation of actually being able to discern which products that you purchase are good for the environment, that's a lot of time to put in every day, to learn, to keep track of. You cannot expect regular people who have things to do in their days so they don't become homeless to keep track of all that shit. bullshit. Much like you can't expect everyone to be their own medical doctor. The whole reason we have those rating systems is supposed to be so that we can make informed consumer choices without being absolute experts on every single field of knowledge that exists on the planet. The problem is, powerful and rich people have corrupted those systems to serve their own interests, because they just have that power. And yet, even though they are forced to pretty much always choose the worse for the environment option in every single aspect of the carbon footprint that they have some measure of control over, the carbon footprint of poor and even just regular average people is an infinitesimal fraction of that of rich people. In fact, over the course of the past 25 years, which has seen an unprecedented rise in emissions, the rise in emissions has been more than 3 times greater for the top 1% of richest people than for the poorest 50% of people combined. There's about 78 million people with access to literally every kind of carbon footprint reduction measure available and imaginable, generating more than thrice the increase than 3.9 billion with a B people who have access to none of that. Billionaires do, after all, love their private jets. This should really show you how meaningless consumer choices actually are. And this is only and exclusively the individual lifestyle choices of the 1%. 71% of all worldwide emissions are generated by 100 corporations. Let me repeat that just to make sure that it didn't slip by you. 100 corporations generate 71% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. That is almost 3/4 of them. And let me tell you, pretty much none of those 100 corporations are corporations that make the average person go, oh, I love that huge corporate entity. It's very important that that thing exists in my life so I can maintain the lifestyle that I have. And guess who owns those 100 corporations? Guess who has literally all of the power to change how these companies operate, has had that power forever, and every single day chooses not to use it because that would cut into their own personal profit margin. It's not the global poor, and it's not, as so many would really like to drill into our heads, the European or American or otherwise living in the world middle class either. It is a tiny group of global oligarchs that benefit from the things that cause climate change and use all of their immense systemic power not only to further those emissions, but to obfuscate as much about the facts surrounding them as possible. And without a doubt, the most effective of these obfuscation tactics has been blaming individual consumer choices over systemic problems and shifting all of the focus of the majority of the conversation on that. Going so far as to claim that they themselves have no choice in how they choose to operate the corporations that they own and have total and full control over, because that isn't what the consumer would want. A huge amount of policy action taken and policy action being campaigned for places an enormous burden on regular people. No climate change debate goes by with somebody telling you specifically that you're gonna have to adjust your lifestyle significantly because you're such a dirty, filthy polluter. And psychologically, that is a narrative that many people really want to hear. The idea that we as individuals can choose to take responsibility and do our part in stopping climate change gives us a degree of power and thus comfort in the face of this overwhelming Lovecraftian catastrophe that we have absolutely no escape from. And it isn't even technically wrong that some of the choices that some consumers can make have some level of impact. It's just that that impact is utterly negligible, even if a significant segment of the population adopts the lifestyle changes necessary to engage in it. This approach is fundamentally not tackling the problem. It is not curbing emissions where they actually originate. Which is the whole point of all this, because all the rich want is to make more money at your expense. They don't care about climate change. If the whole world were to flood, they would all build their private rapture-style utopias and actually literally have whatever survives of the poor peasant population as slaves. Every little bit of focus, attention, and activist effort that falls on regulating micro-consumerism is a little bit of focus, attention, and activist effort that doesn't fall on fighting the fights that will tackle the actual systemic issues that need to be fixed to effectively combat climate change. Because that would dig into the profits of the capitalist class. A lot of wildly unpopular and extremely ineffective environmentalist measures are actually funded by big fossil fuel companies, and they are widely publicized in media outlets owned by the same people that own those fossil fuel companies. The goal of this is not just to make the very notion of environmentalism feel absurd, but also to make you feel as though it's gonna be an attack on your personal lifestyle. You are going to be the one to suffer from this if these environmentalists get their way. This is of course bullshit. Your lifestyle will not be significantly impacted by any of the things that are actually effective. In fact, they might improve your lifestyle significantly, but it does encourage people to seek out alternative narratives, which are of course ubiquitous because they're also funded by fossil fuel companies. Because most people are smart enough to, on some level, understand that they are being asked to pay the bill for climate change. It's just made to look as though environmentalists are the ones who are telling you to do this instead of the capital aristocracy. My absolute favorite example of this is the concept of the meat tax, which is a tax levied on meat products aimed at reducing the consumption of meat, thus being good for the environment. Now, there are countless ways in which the idea that removing meat and animal products from our diet is not actually at all better for the environment, but because that's a very broad topic and we're not going to get into it today, I will also say that there is some merit to this idea as well. Meat taxes are effective at reducing the amount of meat that the general populace consumes by making it more expensive and therefore encouraging people to buy less of it. Specifically, it encourages poor people to buy less meat because they don't have the money to afford meat. Someone middle class or wealthy won't really care if the pork chop is like $2 or $3 more expensive. They have enough money, they don't care. But wealth inequality is so drastic that for someone poor, that means it's just completely unaffordable. $1 or euro or whatever currency it is that you have is worth more to someone poor than it is to someone rich. We call this a regressive tax on poverty because for wealthy people, this is pretty much nothing that they have to pay extra. And the poor, who neither drive nor benefit from climate change, can no longer afford to purchase one of the best sources of nutrition that humans have access to. There is a reason why we have practiced animal husbandry since the dawn of agriculture. It's not just that animals are useful in the farming sector, it's also that meat is highly nutritious, and people deprived of it are generally significantly less healthy than those with ubiquitous access to it. Unless, of course, they're wealthy enough to afford a complex regimen of dietary supplements that need to be tailored to them specifically, because every human being is different, and where we often don't exactly know how or why they work. The people who have contributed the least to climate change, and who have derived no benefit from it, are forced to make a huge sacrifice. The poor are picking up the tab for something they did not reap the rewards of, so the lifestyle of the rich can remain unchanged. And I don't just mean the global rich West, I do mean within the context of the industrialized world, that exact dynamic also exists. And ultimately, this achieves little to nothing. It is at its core libertarian vote with your wallet type bullshit. It is contingent upon the idea that consumers have the same amount of power as capitalists, which is a myth. It's just not true. It's factually and observably Incorrect. Governments are supposed to be the force of balance here and step in to enact the necessary regulations, but as is so often the case, that doesn't happen because the current predominant global ideology is the right-wing ideology of neoliberalism. The neoliberal motto in practice is to privatize the profits and socialize the losses. It is the perfect and deeply insidious incarnation of capitalism that just rules the world today. The idea that the market will somehow just magically fix climate change, which is also demonstrably bullshit because it is the main force driving climate change in the first place, is extremely prevalent among the relevant decision makers. But as climate change continues to wreak havoc on the world and do damage that you can actually measure in whatever currency that you like to use, it's gonna be taxpayer money that tries to make up for that. And a lot of that taxpayer money is gonna go into the profit margins of private corporations. And a lot of private corporations are really looking forward to that. Taxes, by the way, that the rich do not pay their fair share of. So not only are the 1% trying to split the bill when they ordered every single item on the menu twice and you got a salad and a glass of water, they are going to use every ounce of their power to make you pay for all of it. And those ubiquitous humanity is evil narratives that suffuse our culture to a degree unprecedented since the golden age of Catholicism, during which, by the way, they were also used by the powerful to extract money from the poor, they are a driving force in instilling within us shame, guilt, and hatred over our fellow regular human beings that we should be feeling empathy and solidarity for. It is an ancient upper-class narrative designed to dehumanize the common rabble so they can be seen as a resource that can be grown and culled as they see fit. It's the same as with all this neo-Malthusian bullshit surrounding overpopulation. You have just been indoctrinated into putting yourself in false class solidarity with people you have absolutely nothing in common with. In fact, these people would kill you instantly if it even made them the slightest bit more money and they knew they could get away with it. You know, like they're already doing all over the world. The idea that humanity as a whole is to blame for climate change is simply absurd. Climate change is, like pretty much all atrocities, and I call climate change an atrocity very deliberately because that is what it is, driven by a small group of beneficiaries who have the ability to force everyone else to do their bidding. I'm not denying the concept of personal responsibility, I'm just trying to put it into perspective. Measurable outcomes and systemic pressures make people not equally culpable. If I put a gun to your head and told you to shoot someone else, or I will shoot you first because I already have the gun to your head, and you then do that, are you just as culpable as me? What if I put that gun to the head of your loved ones, your family, your partners, your friends, your children? Who's more to blame? The soldier drafted against his will in order to go out onto the battlefield to kill and to die? Or the general who decided to put that soldier there and force him to kill under threat of being tried for desertion and subsequent execution? Who's more to blame? The bank teller working at the institution that gives out predatory loans to minority groups and impoverished people? Or the executive who devised and implemented that scheme? Who is more to blame? The engineer that designed the death machine or a cog inside of that death machine? If you ascribe equal culpability to both parties here, you have been duped. All of the narratives about how humanity is evil, or stupid, or short-sighted, they are all capitalist propaganda. They are designed to make it appear as though people with less agency, who have less power, are exactly as responsible for the things that happened as the people who have all of the agency and all of the power. And it's especially insidious because the poor are put center stage in this. The people who have to work, who have no other choice but to do the bidding of the powerful capitalists. Oh, but look, this is the guy with the bloody knife that are just at least equally as culpable, if not more so. I mean, he is the one who forced me to pay him money to do what I wanted him to do. It is a core part of the scheme to get people to enlist in the military, that those people be so poor that they see the military as the only possible escape from that poverty. But you cannot seriously portray the victims of a system as equally culpable to its architects. They are nowhere near comparable in culpability. But the system makers understand, of course, that every bit of responsibility they can shove around to someone else is a bit of responsibility that they don't have to carry themselves. It's that little streak of blood that those bathing in a tub of red put onto your hands by force so they can claim that, oh look, you've blood on your hands as well. Wash your hands of that blood, especially when it comes to climate change. Focus on bringing those who are actually at fault to trial. The future of our species, and that of countless other species, depends on it. Thank you for watching this very, very angry video. This is a topic that makes me fucking furious. Consider supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar, buying some of my merchandise or my short story collection. And in that spirit, just as a quick aside, some people ask me why I sometimes repeat things that I have said in a video in that video with like different words when the meaning is the same. And the reason I do that is because a lot of people, they think differently. Like different concepts are more familiar to them and make more sense to them. And sometimes it needs like several different metaphors to find the one that like gets through to that particular person. So that's why I do that. And see you around, cunts.